At 5:47 in the morning, a military Black Hawk helicopter punched through the fog above Harlow County General Hospital and dropped hard onto the rooftop landing pad like it owned the place. The rotors hadn't even stopped spinning when four soldiers in full tactical gear stormed the stairwell, weapons drawn, boots hammering concrete. They weren't looking for a doctor. They weren't looking for a surgeon. They were looking for the woman who had been escorted out of the building with a cardboard box and a termination letter exactly 22 minutes earlier. A nurse. The one everyone had decided was the problem. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where stories like this live. Stories about people who were counted out, pushed aside, and then forced the whole world to reckon with what it had lost. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The morning shift at Harlow County General started the way it always did. Too many patients, not enough staff, and a charge nurse already 3 coffees in by 6 a.m. The fluorescent lights in the emergency department buzzed with that particular flatness that made everyone look slightly unwell, which, given the circumstances, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Mara Voss was 45 minutes into a double shift when she noticed the board. 3 patients still waiting on discharge paperwork, a chest pain in Bay 4 that hadn't been properly triaged, and a 12-year-old in the pediatric corridor who'd been flagged for a routine observation, but whose chart, if anyone had actually read it, showed something that didn't quite add up. She read it. Most people wouldn't have. The attending had already signed off. The resident had already moved on. The boy's mother was already helping him put on his jacket. Mara set down her clipboard and walked to Bay 7 without making a production of it. "Hey, buddy," she said, crouching to the kid's level. "How's your head feeling right now? Be honest." The boy, whose name was Toby, squinted at her. "Kind of weird, like pressure, but the doctor said I'm fine." Mara looked at the mother. "When did the headache start?" "He said it started after the fall, but which side?" The mother blinked. "The right. Why?" Mara didn't answer immediately. She pulled her penlight from her breast pocket and checked his pupils. Left one responded normally. Right one lagged. Just slightly. Just enough. "I need to get your son back into imaging," Mara said, and her voice was level, completely level, because this was not the moment to scare the woman into paralysis. "It's probably nothing, but I'd rather we check." She flagged down the charge resident, Dr. Pete Galloway, who had the particular energy of a man who believed he'd already solved every problem in his vicinity. "Voss." He didn't look up from his tablet. "Toby Reinhold was cleared an hour ago. His pupils aren't matching. He's 12. He fell off a skateboard. He's fine. His right pupil is sluggish." Galloway finally looked at her. And there it was, that expression she had learned to recognize over the past 14 months at Harlow County. The one that said, "You're a nurse, and I'm a doctor, and you should know what that means." "I'll note your concern in the chart," he said. Mara stood there for 1 second. Then she turned around and walked directly to the attending on call, Dr. Sandra Pruitt, who was mid-bite of a granola bar at the nursing station. "Sandra, I need a CT on Toby Reinhold in 7. His pupil response is off." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then she set down the granola bar. "You already talked to Galloway?" He passed. Something moved across Pruitt's face. "I'll take a look." 20 minutes later, Toby Reinhold was being prepped for emergency surgery to relieve a subdural hematoma that, without intervention, would have killed him before noon. No one came to find Mara afterward. No one said good catch. Galloway filed an incident report that evening, claiming the oversight had been caught during routine rounds. Mara's name didn't appear in it once. She found out when she went to sign off on the follow-up documentation and saw his version sitting in the system, clean and neat and wrong. She stood at that computer terminal for a long time, reading it twice. Then she saved a copy to her personal email, which she would later understand was the most important thing she did that entire year, and went back to work. That was 11 weeks ago. Mara Voss had come to Harlow County General from a life she didn't talk about. She'd grown up outside of Spokane, the kind of middle-distance suburb that produces either very ambitious people or very comfortable ones, and she had been neither. She'd been restless. She'd enrolled in the Army at 19 with the vague intention of getting out of her own head, and instead she'd found something she was actually good at. Not fighting, not tactics, though she learned those too. She was good at keeping people alive in conditions designed to kill them. She spent 8 years as a combat medical specialist, 2 of them embedded with a special operations unit she still couldn't name without appropriate clearance. She'd done 3 rotations, 2 in the Middle East, 1 classified, and had received a commendation she kept in a drawer under her winter sweaters and never mentioned to anyone. She left the military at 27 because her mother was sick and because she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She transitioned to civilian nursing through an accelerated program designed for military medics, completed her credentials in 14 months, and arrived at Harlow County General Hospital in Millbrook, Oregon, with no fanfare, no references anyone checked carefully enough, and a very thorough understanding of what a human body looked like when it was about to stop working. The hospital hired her because they needed staff. They had no idea what they'd actually gotten. Director of Nursing Pamela Storch had an office on the 3rd floor with a view of the parking structure and a management philosophy that could be summarized unkindly but accurately as, "Don't make my life complicated." She was not a bad person. She was an institutional person, which in certain contexts produced similar results. She became aware of Mara Voss in her 3rd month on the job, when 2 physicians separately came to her office to complain that a nurse in the ER was, as Dr. Curtis Blackwell put it, practicing above her scope. Storch had pulled Mara's record. Nothing actionable. Patient outcomes were good. Better than good. But the complaints kept coming. By month 6, Mara had been moved to a less desirable shift rotation. By month 9, her annual review had been downgraded from exceeds expectations to meets expectations without specific explanation. By month 11, she had received 2 written warnings, one for failure to follow physician directive. She had escalated a patient Galloway told her was stable, the patient had sepsis, and one for insubordination. She had asked Blackwell, in front of 2 other nurses, to explain his reasoning on a medication dosage she believed was wrong. She had been right, but that wasn't the point anyone chose to focus on. She knew what was happening. She had seen versions of it before, in a different kind of institution, where the consequences were different, but the mechanics were identical. A system deciding that someone who noticed too much was more trouble than they were worth. She kept showing up. She kept documenting everything. She kept saving copies. The final incident happened on a Tuesday. A woman named Rosalind Fitch was brought into the ER at 11:15 p.m. after what her husband described as a funny episode. She'd gone pale, grabbed the kitchen counter, said she felt strange, and then recovered within a minute. Her husband had wanted to wait until morning, but she'd insisted. Dr. Blackwell saw her at 11:40. EKG looked fine. BP was slightly elevated, but nothing alarming. He wrote it up as a vasovagal episode, gave her a pamphlet about stress management, and told her she could go home. Mara was doing handoff when she caught the chart. She read it standing in the hallway. Then she went into the bay. Rosalind Fitch was 62 years old, which Blackwell had noted. What he had not noted was that she was also diabetic, had a family history of sudden cardiac events on her mother's side that was buried in the social history portion of the intake form that no one had pulled, and that her color, which looked fine under the fluorescent lights at a glance, was slightly off in a way that Mara's particular set of years and experiences made her recognize as wrong. She also had mild jaw tightness. She mentioned only when Mara asked if anything else felt strange. "Just a little sore," Rosalind said. "Probably slept funny." Mara excused herself, went to find Blackwell, and told him she thought Rosalind Fitch needed a troponin panel and extended cardiac monitoring. Blackwell looked at her with the particular exhaustion of a man who has explained the hierarchy of medicine to a nurse more than once and resents that he has to keep doing it. "She had a vasovagal episode, Voss. Her jaw is sore. She's diabetic. Her family history. I saw the chart. The social history. Her mother died of a silent MI at 64. I appreciate your input. Dr. Blackwell. She's going home, Voss. I'm done with this conversation." Mara stood in the corridor after he walked away and thought very carefully about what she was about to do. She thought about the 2 written warnings already in her file. She thought about what Storch had told her during the last meeting. One more documented issue, and we'll have to revisit your employment status. She thought about the rent on her apartment and her mother's pharmacy copays. Then she went back into the bay. "Mrs. Fitch," she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. A doctor has cleared you to go home, and that is his call to make. But I'd like you to consider staying a little longer so we can run some additional blood work. It won't take long. The decision is yours." Rosalind looked at her husband, then at Mara. "What are you worried about?" "Your heart," Mara said. "I just want to be sure." Rosalind stayed. The troponin came back elevated. She was in the cardiac catheterization lab by 3 a.m. with a 90% left anterior descending artery blockage, the kind cardiologists call the widowmaker, because of what happens when it doesn't get caught. It got caught. Rosalind Fitch went home 5 days later with a stent and a follow-up appointment and a very clear understanding that she had come within hours of dying in her own kitchen. Mara was handed a termination letter at 7:15 the following morning. The letter cited repeated insubordination, failure to comply with physician directives, and conduct detrimental to the institutional culture of Harlow County General Hospital. Pamela Storch delivered it in person, with the particular grimness of someone who has convinced themselves they had no choice. "I'm sorry, Mara. We've given you multiple opportunities to adjust." Mara looked at the letter, then at Storch. "Rosalind Fitch is alive." "That's not the point being addressed here." "It should be." She signed the acknowledgement form. She collected her things, badge, stethoscope, the small photo of her niece she kept taped to her locker, put them in the cardboard box they'd apparently already prepared, and walked through the ER one last time. Nobody said anything. One nurse, a younger woman named Tessa Birch, who had been on shift the night Rosalind Fitch came in, watched Mara cross the floor and looked like she wanted to say something. She didn't. Mara pushed through the exit and walked into the pale gray of an Oregon morning that had not yet decided whether it wanted to rain. She sat in her car in the parking garage on level 2 and did not, despite everything, cry. She was not proud of that exactly. It wasn't stoicism so much as it was a particular kind of emotional blankness that set in sometimes when things went the way she'd already expected them to. She'd learned in the military that there was a specific flavor of exhaustion that came not from surprise, but from being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. She sat there. She thought about her next move. She had savings. Not a lot, but enough for 2 months. She had her credentials. She had documentation of everything, every incident, every patient outcome, every file she'd quietly copied and preserved over 14 months. She had the quiet, particular satisfaction of knowing that Rosalind Fitch was currently in the cardiac unit on the 4th floor with a functioning heart. She pulled out her phone to start drafting a message to a former colleague who'd mentioned a travel nurse position in Portland. That was when she heard it. It started as a sound in the upper distance, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that she recognized before she consciously processed it, because that particular frequency was stored somewhere below the level of thought, in the part of her that had learned what it meant a long time ago. Rotors. Military rotors. The distinctive heavy percussion of a Blackhawk, not the lighter chop of a news or medevac helicopter. She knew the difference the same way a musician knows the difference between instruments. Not from thinking about it, but from having heard it so many times the distinction had become automatic. She looked up through the concrete of the parking structure as if she could see through it. The sound grew louder. Then it changed pitch. It was landing on the hospital roof. Mara sat very still. She heard shouting from inside the garage. A security guard running, radio crackling, someone's voice elevated and urgent in the distance. Through the gap where the garage met the exterior, she could see the pulse of a red warning light from above, the kind that activated when the rooftop landing pad was in use. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it for 1 second. "Voss," she said. The voice on the other end was clipped, controlled, and unmistakably military. "This is Captain Roland Merritt, 13th Special Operations Support Battalion. We have a situation. I was told you no longer work at this facility. Is that accurate?" "As of about 20 minutes ago. Yeah." "Where are you?" She looked around the parking garage. "Level 2. Why?" "Don't move." The line went dead. 40 seconds later, she heard boots on concrete. Fast, purposeful, not the soft shuffle of hospital staff, but the hard cadence of people who moved like movement was the thing they were trained for. 2 soldiers in tactical gear rounded the corner of the parking structure and stopped when they saw her standing next to her car with a cardboard box in her arms. The one in front looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Mara Voss?" "That's me." We need you to come with us right now. She looked at the box, looked at them. What's happening? Our primary surgical team is down. We have a soldier with a thoracic injury that our on-site staff have not been able to stabilize. We have a 6-hour window. Your name came up. From who? The soldier didn't answer that. Ma'am, he said instead, and there was something in his voice, not pleading, because these were not men who pleaded, but something close to urgency stripped of everything decorative. We don't have a lot of time. Mara set the cardboard box on the hood of her car. She took exactly 2 seconds. Let's go, she said. They moved back through the parking garage toward the stairwell entrance at a pace that was not quite running but wasn't walking either, and Mara was already running through the details in her head. Thoracic, 6 hours, primary team down, and the particular focused stillness that always came over her in these moments was already settling in, replacing everything else. Behind her, on the hood of her car, the cardboard box sat with her badge and her stethoscope and the photo of her niece, in a parking garage of a hospital that had just decided she was expendable. On the 4th floor of that same building, Pamela Storch was at her desk preparing to email HR about closing out Mara Voss's personnel file. She heard the helicopter. She stood up and went to the window. She could see the rooftop from that angle, the Black Hawk, the soldiers, and a woman in civilian clothes walking across the landing pad without hesitating, ducking under the rotors with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before. Many times. Storch watched until the helicopter lifted. She stood at the window for a long time after it disappeared into the clouds, and something moved across her face that she couldn't quite name, though if she'd been honest with herself, it might have been the very early edge of understanding that she had just watched herself make the worst professional decision of her life. The helicopter banked hard left as it cleared the hospital roof, and Mara grabbed the cargo strap above her head without thinking, the way you do when your body remembers things your mind has spent years trying to file away. The 2 soldiers across from her didn't speak. They watched her with the particular evaluating stillness of people who assess everything and show nothing, and Mara let them look, because she understood that language. She'd spoken it herself for 8 years. Captain Roland Merritt was in the co-pilot seat. He turned back once after they leveled out and looked at her with the kind of directness that skipped pleasantries entirely. You were at Fort Kavanaugh, 2nd SOSG. Medical. It wasn't a question. Attached, Mara said. I wasn't organic to the unit. Colonel Dex Hargrove put your name in. Said if we had a thoracic problem we couldn't crack, you were the call. Dex Hargrove. She hadn't heard that name in 4 years. He'd been her commanding officer for 14 months during her 2nd rotation, a large, unhurried man from rural Tennessee who had the disconcerting habit of being completely right about everything and never making you feel good about it. How bad is the injury? She asked. Merritt turned back to face forward. Bad enough that we called you. That was all she got for the next 19 minutes. The facility was not on any map she'd seen, which told her something. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines about 40 miles east of Millbrook, low buildings arranged around a central structure, the kind of layout designed to look unremarkable from altitude. There were vehicles parked in patterns that suggested recent activity. Not chaos, but the organized urgency of a place that had been operating at elevated intensity for hours. They landed in a dirt clearing, and Mara was moving before the skids fully settled, following a medic named Corporal Yolanda Prest, who had been waiting at the edge of the pad and was already walking fast. Soldier's name is Staff Sergeant Owen Rafferty, Prest said, not slowing down. 34. Mission went sideways 14 hours ago. GSW to the right chest. We got the bleeding controlled, but his respiratory status has been declining for the last 2 hours, and our surgeon can't figure out why. Who's your surgeon? Captain Levin. He's good. That's why we're worried. They pushed through a set of double doors into a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and Prest handed Mara a pair of gloves without breaking stride. Any imaging? Mara asked. Chest x-ray 2 hours ago. Looked okay. What about since? Prest glanced at her sideways. We didn't repeat it. Mara didn't say anything to that. She pulled on the gloves. The room they brought her into was not an OR. It was a trauma bay, well equipped for the field, but not for what it was currently being asked to do. Captain Levin was a compact man in his early 40s, with the focused, slightly brittle expression of someone who had been staring at an unsolvable problem long enough that the edges were starting to show. He looked up when Mara came in, and she could see him process the information. Civilian clothes, no rank, and someone had flown her in. He didn't look grateful. He looked guarded. Levin, Merritt said from the doorway. This is Voss. She's consulting. I know who she is, Levin said, which was interesting because Mara had never met him. What I don't know is what she's going to see that I haven't. Mara walked to Rafferty's bedside. Owen Rafferty was large, even lying down, the kind of build that comes from years of physical work rather than a gym, and his face had the particular gray-yellow color of someone whose body was fighting something it didn't have the resources to beat. His breathing was the first thing she clocked, shallow, labored, with a slight asymmetry on the right side that was subtle enough that you'd miss it if you weren't specifically looking for chest wall movement differentials. She was. She put her hand on his right chest wall and had him breathe. Then she moved to the left. She took a pen light and checked his neck. She looked at his jugular veins. His JVDs are elevated, she said. Mildly, Levin said. Trachea shifted? Minimally. When did his BP start dropping? About 90 minutes ago. We corrected with fluids. And it dropped again. Yes. Mara stood back from the bed. The picture was assembling itself in her head with the cold, orderly clarity that had always been her particular gift. Not brilliance exactly, but a very specific form of pattern recognition that came from having seen enough people in various stages of dying that the signals had become a kind of language she read almost automatically. His breath sounds on the right, she said. Bilateral? Levin hesitated. Diminished on the right, but we accounted for that given the injury. What's his pulse ox? 91. It was 96 when we first stabilized him, Press said quietly, from the corner. Mara looked at Levin. He has a tension pneumothorax developing, slow one. That's why the x-ray looked okay. It was early. The bullet trajectory probably nicked the visceral pleura, and it's been leaking since. Levin was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet. We had a chest tube in, he said. Is it still patent? Another pause, longer this time. Mara turned to look at him directly. She wasn't challenging him. She was just looking. Can you check the tube? Levin moved to the patient's side and checked the drainage system. She watched his face. She saw the moment he found it. A subtle shift, not shame exactly, more like the expression of someone recalculating. There's a kink, he said. Distal third. The air's not clearing, Mara said. That's why he's declining. Levin straightened the tube. Fixed the kink. It took less than a minute. The change wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like the movies, where everything resolves in a rush and the patient gasps back to color. It was slower than that, and more uncertain, and Rafferty's oxygen sat at 91 for another 4 minutes before it started to creep. 92, 93, a pause, 94. Nobody in the room said anything. At 96, Levin exhaled. All right, he said, and his voice had changed slightly. Okay. Mara pulled off her outer gloves and looked at Rafferty's face. Some of the gray was already going out of it. He'll need close monitoring, she said. Repeat imaging in an hour. If he desats again, you're looking at a second tube or a thoracostomy, but I don't think you'll need it. Levin nodded. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. She understood that the thank you would have required him to acknowledge something he wasn't ready to put into words yet, and she'd worked with enough surgeons to know that you didn't push that moment. Merritt was still in the doorway. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Come with me, he said. He took her to a small room that served as a combination briefing space and break room, the kind of utilitarian double purpose that spoke of limited space and no time for luxury. There was a folding table, 4 chairs, a coffee maker that looked like it had seen things. He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of her. Hargrove sent me more than just your name, Merritt said. He sent me your file. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was bad. She drank it anyway. The official one or the other one? Merritt looked at her. There's an official one? She almost smiled. Your record from the 13th is... He stopped, seemed to choose a word carefully. Not what I expected from a civilian ER nurse. I'm not really a civilian ER nurse. I know that now. He set down his cup. Hargrove said you worked a joint mission in the Paktika province, 2019. 6-person team, 2 of them down. You performed field surgery for 11 hours until extraction. 8 hours, she said. Extraction was delayed. Both soldiers survived. One of them lost a kidney. But he's alive. She didn't respond to that. It was true, but she had never found the survived half of that sentence as settling as people seemed to think she should. Merritt leaned back in his chair. So I want to understand something. How does a person with that background end up getting fired from a community hospital in Oregon for insubordination? The question landed in the room and sat there. Mara thought about how to answer it. She thought about all the true things she could say, about Blackwell and Galloway and Storch, about the written warnings and the downgraded reviews and the careful, institutional way that someone who notices too much gets quietly dismantled. She thought about Rosalind Fitch in the cardiac unit with a new stent and a functioning heart, and about the incident report that had replaced her name with Galloway's. Institutions don't always like being corrected, she said finally, even when the correction saves somebody's life. Merritt looked at her for a moment. Hargrove also said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever supervised. He said that? He said it like it was a compliment. He's a complicated man. Merritt picked up his coffee again. We have a situation, Voss. Rafferty is stable now, which is good, but he's not out of the woods, and our medical team is thinly stretched. I'd like you to stay on site for the next 48 hours. Consulting capacity. I was just terminated. I'm aware. I don't have privileges here. This isn't that kind of facility. She looked at him. What kind of facility is it? He didn't answer that either. She stayed, awed. The next 36 hours moved in that particular compressed way that Mara associated with high acuity environments. Time didn't pass normally. It concertinaed, expanding in the slow stretches between crises and collapsing when something required absolute attention. She slept 4 hours on a cot in the room adjacent to the trauma bay and ate whatever press put in front of her and spent the rest of the time monitoring Rafferty, who improved steadily and with the stubborn incremental slowness of someone whose body had been through genuine trauma and was not interested in being rushed. On the second morning, he was awake. He was not, Mara quickly discovered, an easy patient. I don't need that IV anymore, he told her when she came to check his line. The IV stays. I'm fine. You had a collapsed lung yesterday. It's not collapsed now. She looked at him. He had the particular affect of someone who had spent a long time in situations where admitting weakness had real consequences, and she recognized it because she had it herself and had spent years learning to work around it in a medical context. The IV stays, she said again. When was the last time you slept? I sleep fine. Your pulse ox dipped at EO 300. That usually means you're working harder to breathe than you should be when you're relaxed, which means you're not relaxing. He looked at her with something that was almost irritation but had a question underneath it. How long have you been a nurse? Long enough. You don't seem like a nurse. I get that a lot. He was quiet for a moment. Merritt said they pulled you off another job to come here. Something like that. Were you in the middle of something important? She thought about the cardboard box sitting on the hood of her car in a parking garage. No, she said. Not anymore. She was reviewing his latest chest imaging when Merritt found her in the corridor with an expression that meant something had shifted. We have a problem, he said. Rafferty? No, different problem. He glanced down the hallway in both directions, which was the kind of thing that made Mara's attention sharpen in a specific way. The hospital you came from, Harlow County. She waited. I made some calls this morning, looking into why someone with your background was working civilian ER and got terminated for the reasons in that letter. He paused. Turns out there are several patient families who've been trying to file complaints with the state medical board. Outcomes they weren't satisfied with. Situations where they felt something was missed. That's not unusual, Mara said carefully. No, but what's unusual is that in 4 of those cases, there are nursing notes that got altered after the fact. Not deleted, altered. Changed in ways that shifted the documented timeline of who said what and when. The air in the corridor felt different suddenly. How do you know this? She asked. I told you. I made calls. He looked at her steadily. Someone at that hospital has been quietly revising records. And the pattern, according to the person I spoke with, is consistent enough that it looks like it was done to protect specific physicians from liability. Mara thought about the incident report with Galloway's name where hers should have been. She thought about the written warnings that had framed her escalations as insubordination. She thought about the 14 months of documentation she had saved to her personal email with the methodical, almost unconscious caution of someone who had spent years in environments where paper trails were the difference between accountability and impunity. "There's going to be an investigation," Merritt said. "I don't know what that looks like yet or who's driving it, but the person I spoke with, they're with the State Oversight Board. They asked if I knew how to reach you." "Why would the Oversight Board be talking to you?" Merritt's expression was even. "Because one of the patients in those 4 cases was a retired officer. His family made noise with people who had the kind of connections that get calls returned quickly." She understood then. This hadn't started because of Rosalind Fitch or Toby Reinhold or any of the cases she'd fought for. It had started because one family had a name that opened the right doors. And once those doors opened, everything behind them was visible. She felt something complicated move through her. Not quite satisfaction, because satisfaction would have been too clean for what this was. It was closer to the feeling of watching a very slow structural collapse that you'd seen coming for a long time, and not being sure whether the fact that you'd been right about it made anything better. "What do they need from me?" she asked. "Documentation, anything you have, dates, records, your own written accounts of incidents." "I have documentation." Merritt looked at her with a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise. "How much?" 14 months' worth, Mara said. "Every incident, every patient, every conversation I logged. I kept copies of everything." He was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove really wasn't kidding about you," he said. She sent the files that evening from a secure terminal Merritt provided. 14 months of methodically preserved records, organized by date and patient identifier, each incident cross-referenced with the outcome and her documented concern at the time. Reading back through them as she prepared the files was a strange experience. It was like watching a slow-motion record of a place making a series of choices that each seemed, in isolation, defensible, and only revealed their true shape when you laid them end to end. She thought about the nurses who had watched her walk out that morning. Tessa Birch, with her open expression and her closed mouth. The others who had made brief eye contact and looked away. She didn't blame them exactly. She understood the math of institutional survival. She had done versions of it herself, in different settings, knowing when the cost of speaking was more than she could reasonably pay. But she had also learned, in the particular school of experience she'd attended, that silence had its own cost. It was just a deferred one. It accrued interest. Rafferty was sitting up when she went back to check on him that night, which was progress. He had a tablet in his lap, and he looked like a man who had decided that since he was stuck in bed, he was going to be aggressively productive about it. "You should be sleeping," she said. "I will. Now." He looked at her over the edge of the tablet with the expression of someone who was deciding whether or not she had the authority to tell him what to do. "Merritt told me what they found about your hospital." "Former hospital." "Right." He set the tablet down. "He also told me you had documentation ready." "I'm careful," she said. "That's one word for it." He studied her for a moment. "The people who fired you, do they know yet that there's an investigation?" "I don't think so. Not yet." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "My mother was a nurse." Mara looked at him. "County hospital, 32 years. She used to come home sometimes and just not talk. Not for hours. My dad thought it was because she was tired." He paused. "It wasn't because she was tired." Mara understood what he was saying, which was that he understood something too. She didn't respond with words because the moment didn't need them. She checked his vitals, made a note in the chart, and was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Hey, Voss." She stopped. "Whoever made those calls about your hospital, whoever got the investigation started." He was looking at her with a directness that had something careful behind it. "Make sure it's enough. Don't let them do paperwork accountability and call it done." She looked at him. "I mean," he said, "if you have everything documented the way Merritt says you do, make sure it goes to the right people. All of it, not just the parts that are easy to explain." She thought about Blackwell and his medication dosage, about Galloway and the incident report, about the altered records and the 4 patient families who had found a way to make noise, about Storch watching the helicopter from her 3rd-floor window. "I know who to send it to," she said. She went back to her cot and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, And in the morning, before Rafferty's 0600 check, her phone showed a new email from an address she didn't recognize, with a subject line that read, Harlow County General, State Medical Board Preliminary Review. She opened it. She read the first paragraph. The investigation had been formally opened, and attached to the bottom of the email, forwarded from the board's intake office with a note that it had arrived that morning from an anonymous internal submission, was a document she had never seen before. A complete record of every nursing note that had been altered at Harlow County General Hospital over the past 11 months, with the original version and the revised version side by side, and in the metadata of each altered file, the same user ID appearing again and again in the modification log. She read the name attached to that ID. She read it twice. It wasn't Blackwell. It wasn't Galloway. It was Pamela Storch. The name sat in the center of the screen and didn't move, because names don't move, but Mara's eyes moved over it 3 times anyway, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to accept the first read as final. Pamela Storch. Not Blackwell, who had the ego for it. Not Galloway, who had the motive. Storch, who had delivered the termination letter with the quiet grimness of someone performing an unpleasant duty, who had said, "We've given you multiple opportunities to adjust," as though she were doing Mara a courtesy, who had stood at her 3rd-floor window and watched the helicopter rise. Mara set the phone face down on the cot and stared at the ceiling for approximately 90 seconds. Then she picked it up again and read the full email. The internal submission had come through the board's anonymous reporting portal at 4:17 a.m., early enough that whoever sent it had either been awake all night working up the nerve or had been waiting for a specific moment and decided that moment was now. The metadata comparison document was thorough in a way that suggested professional preparation, not a panicked whistleblower. Whoever had compiled it understood how to present evidence, which meant they'd probably been thinking about this for a while. She forwarded the email to the secure address Merritt had given her, added a 2-line note, "See attached. This changes the scope. Call me when you're up," and lay back down. She did not sleep again. So, Merritt found her at 0615 in the corridor outside Rafferty's room. He looked like a man who had also not slept, which was either a coincidence or meant he'd been reading the same email. "You saw it," she said, 20 minutes ago. "Who sent it?" "Board doesn't know. Anonymous submission, but someone at that hospital had access to the system audit logs, which means it was either IT, administration, or someone with admin-level credentials." He paused. "Or someone who knew where to look and had enough time." Mara thought about that. 14 months of watching things happen, of logging incidents and saving copies and keeping a record that no one knew she was keeping. She wasn't the only one who might have been doing that. She just hadn't known there was anyone else. "Does Storch know?" she asked. "Not yet. The board's preliminary review opened at 0600. Standard procedure is to notify the institution within 48 hours. He looked at her steadily, which means she has 2 days before she knows this is moving. 2 days to delete things. The board is aware of that. They've requested a preservation hold on all electronic records at Harlow County General. IT freeze effective this morning. She absorbed that. The machine, once it started moving, moved faster than she'd expected. What happens now? Formally, the board conducts a records review. If what's in that document holds up, and from what I saw, it will, they escalate to a full investigation, which triggers mandatory reporting to the hospital's credentialing bodies and the state health department. Merritt crossed his arms. Informally? Someone just handed the board a compiled evidence package that makes their job significantly easier, and they're going to use it. And my documentation? Already in their system. It corroborates the timeline in the anonymous submission on 6 separate incidents. He looked at her the way people looked at you when they were recalculating something. You kept records of everything. "I knew what was happening," she said. "I just didn't know it was also happening above my level." He was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, a door opened and Corporal Prest appeared, caught Merritt's eye, and gave a small nod that conveyed Rafferty's status without requiring words. Merritt returned the nod and looked back at Mara. "There's something else," he said. "The retired officer whose family filed the original complaint, Colonel Warren Bast. He died 4 months ago, post-surgical complications." She waited. "His family believes the complication was preventable, that there were signs missed in post-op monitoring. The nursing notes in his file were among the ones altered." Merritt's voice didn't change inflection, but something behind it did. He was 13th Battalion, 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments. Mara understood what he wasn't saying, which was that this investigation was no longer just a regulatory matter. It had the attention of people for whom Warren Bast was not a case number, and that attention would not be patient with procedural delay or institutional foot-dragging. "I need to get back to Rafferty," she said. "I know. But I want to know when the board contacts Harlow County." "You'll know when I know," he said, which she took as a yes. Rafferty was trying to sit up without using the bed controls when she came in, which she stopped by appearing in his line of sight and giving him the look she had developed specifically for patients who believed their recovery was a personal inconvenience they could willpower their way past. "I'm testing my range of motion," he said. "You're pulling your chest tube insertion site." He stopped. "It's fine." "It was fine. Now you're making it interesting." She moved to his side and checked the dressing. The site was intact, no signs of fresh bleeding, but the area around it had the pinkish warmth of irritated tissue. "Lie back." He lay back. With, she noted, the specific controlled slowness of someone managing pain they weren't going to mention. "Scale of 1 to 10, she said. 3. "Try again." A pause. 5. "Maybe 6. "That's better." She made a note. "I'm adding a low-dose anti-inflammatory. It'll take the edge off without compromising your respiratory function." "I don't like taking things." "I know. Take it anyway." He looked at her with the kind of evaluating blankness that she had learned over the past 2 days was actually how he looked when he was thinking carefully rather than when he was disengaged. "Merritt told me about the investigation," he said. "The colonel, Bast." "It's moving," she said. "He was a good officer," Rafferty said, and there was nothing dramatic in his voice, just the flat factual weight of someone who had known the person and was now placing that knowledge next to what they'd just learned. His family had a hard time with it. His daughter was the one who started making calls. Mara thought about a woman making calls after losing her father, not knowing if anything would come of it, not knowing if anyone was listening. She thought about what it took to keep making them. "She didn't stop," Rafferty said, as though he'd read the direction of that thought. "Even when people told her it was just complications, that these things happen. She kept asking for records, kept pushing. The hospital kept telling her everything was documented correctly." "It was," Mara said. "After they changed it." The room held that for a moment. "She should know," Rafferty said. "She will." The second escalation arrived at 1100, in the form of a phone call Merritt took in the corridor that Mara heard the tail end of through the half-open door of the briefing room. She heard his tone change, not in volume, but in texture, the shift that happens when a conversation moves from informational to consequential. And when he appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later, his expression had the particular set of a man receiving a problem and deciding in real time what to do with it. "Harlow County's legal counsel filed an emergency injunction this morning," he said, "against the records freeze." She looked at him. "On what grounds?" "Privacy concerns for current patients. Standard procedural objection." He sat down across from her. "It'll get denied probably by end of day, but it creates a window." "A window for what?" "For anyone inside that institution to move things around before the freeze is fully enforced." He put his hands flat on the table. "The board's IT team is good, but the injunction delays their access by a few hours. The hospital's legal team knows that." "Storch knows," Mara said. "She might." "She's not stupid, Merritt. She's been running a careful operation for at least 11 months. If she has any read at all on what's happening, she will use that window." "The board is aware." "Does the board have someone inside the building right now?" He looked at her for a moment. "That's not how the board works." "Then someone needs to be." The silence that followed had a specific quality, the kind that forms when a person in authority is thinking through something they know is necessary and working out how to make it procedurally defensible. "I can't send you in there," he said. "You were terminated. You have no standing to be on that property." "I wasn't suggesting you send me." "Then who—" "The anonymous submission," Mara said. "Whoever sent it, they're still in the building, they have access, and they've already shown they're willing to act." Merritt looked at her steadily. "You know who it is?" "I have a strong guess." She thought about Tessa Birch standing at the edge of the ER floor, watching Mara cross toward the exit with her cardboard box, with the expression of someone who wanted to say something and had made the calculation that the cost was too high. She thought about what might change that calculation, what might tip it. "I need to make a call," she said. He pushed his phone across the table. Well, Tessa Birch picked up on the third ring with the careful neutrality of someone who had been expecting this and had not yet decided what to do about it. "I only have a minute," Tessa said immediately, which told Mara she was somewhere she couldn't speak freely. "I know what you sent," Mara said, "or I think I do. I'm not asking you to confirm it." A pause. "Okay. I need you to know that it reached the right people, and that it matters. The board has it." Another pause, longer. "I've been—" Tessa started, then stopped. Then started again, quieter. "I've been pulling those audit logs for 3 weeks. I didn't know if anyone would— if it was even enough." "It's enough," Mara said. "But right now the hospital has filed an injunction to slow the records freeze. I need you to tell me if anything is being moved in the system this morning. Accessed, deleted, changed." "I can't access administration-level records," Tessa said. "I'm a floor nurse." "I know, but you can tell me if something looks wrong, if people are moving fast, if Storch is in early, if legal has been through the office, if IT is running unusual maintenance." A long silence. "Legal was in the building when I arrived this morning," Tessa said finally. "2 of them. They went straight to administration. That was—" She paused. 40 minutes ago. Are they still there?" "I don't know." "Tessa." Mara kept her voice level. Not urgent, not pressuring, just even. "You have already done the hardest thing. I'm asking you to do one more. Document what you're seeing right now. Timestamps. Who went where. What you observed. And if anything changes in the system, anything in the patient records you can access, note it with a timestamp and get it out of the building." "Out how?" "Email it to yourself, personal account, right now before they restrict anything." Silence. "You're asking me to do something that could get me fired," Tessa said. "Yes," Mara said. "I am." She didn't soften. She didn't tell Tessa it would be fine because she didn't know that it would be. And she had decided a long time ago that she would rather be honest about the cost of things than make promises she couldn't keep. "You got fired," Tessa said, and it wasn't an accusation. It sounded more like someone calibrating. "I did," Mara said. "And I'd do it the same way again." The line was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Tessa said. "I'll do it." The call ended. Mara handed the phone back to Merritt and sat for a moment with the specific discomfort of having asked someone else to take a risk she'd already paid the price for herself. She didn't like it. But the alternative was a 2-day window in which evidence disappeared and institutional lawyers bought enough time to muddy every clear line into something ambiguous enough to survive a board review. "Your contact inside the building," Merritt said. "A nurse. Young. She's been paying attention." He looked at his phone for a moment. "If she's the one who sent the submission, don't ask me that." He considered that, then accepted it. "All right." Rafferty's 1400 check showed continued improvement. His O2 sat had stabilized at 97%. The chest tube drainage had slowed to the expected trickle of late-stage resolution, and the inflammation around the insertion site had responded to the anti-inflammatory without any adverse reaction. He was eating, which he did with the particular efficiency of someone treating food as fuel rather than an experience, and he had stopped trying to sit up without help, which Mara counted as a significant clinical victory. "You look like something's happening," he said when she came in. "Things are happening," she said. "Good things or bad things?" "Both. The way it usually is." He watched her check his drainage output. "The investigation?" "Moving, faster than expected, which is good, but there are people trying to slow it down." "The director, Storch." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I've been in situations where the person running the operation was also the person compromising it. It's a specific kind of problem." He looked at the ceiling. "The solution is usually to remove them from the position before they can do more damage. But the tricky part is that in institutional environments, you can't just remove someone. You have to build the case first, and while you're building, they're still in the seat." "That's exactly the problem," Mara said. "How long until the board has enough to move on Storch directly?" "Days, maybe. If the records hold, if nothing disappears in the next few hours." She finished her notation and capped the pen. The injunction buys the hospital's legal team time. I have someone on the inside, but she's a floor nurse with limited access. Rafferty thought about that. What does Merritt's contact at the board say? That the injunction will be denied by end of day. End of day is 6 hours from now. I know. He looked at her with the directness that she had come to recognize as simply how he communicated, stripped of the social padding that most people used as buffer. What's the worst case if something disappears? She considered it honestly. The Bast family case becomes harder to prove. The pattern of alteration loses some of its consistency. The board can still act on what they have, but it becomes a matter of degree instead of a matter of clear, documented evidence of systematic falsification. So it goes from a definitive case to a debatable one, potentially. And the people who hurt those patients get something closer to a slap than a consequence. She met his eyes. Yes. He looked at the ceiling again. I hate institutional corruption, he said, with the flat disgust of someone who had encountered it in multiple contexts and found it equally offensive each time. It always hides behind process. People die, and there's a committee meeting. He wasn't wrong, and she didn't argue with it. Her phone buzzed. Tessa. She stepped into the hallway and answered. Something's happening, Tessa said, and her voice had the controlled quality of someone in a shared space trying not to be overheard. It just pushed a maintenance flag on 3 administrative accounts. But it's not scheduled maintenance. I checked the posted schedule this morning. There's nothing on it. Mara's grip on the phone tightened. Which accounts? I can only see the flag notification because it pushed to the floor system as a general advisory. I can't see which specific accounts. But the flag went up 14 minutes ago, and Storch has been in her office with the door closed since 0800. Is legal still in the building? I saw one of them leave 30 minutes ago. The other one's still in administration. Tessa, the patients whose records were altered, do you have access to any of their files? Some of them are still active charts, outpatient follow-up. Check one. Right now, while we're talking, pull up one of the altered charts and tell me if the modification timestamp has changed since this morning. She heard the soft sounds of a keyboard. Tessa moving fast and trying to look like she wasn't. 30 seconds. 40. Oh, Tessa said, just that one syllable. But the register of it, the particular compressed quality of someone looking at something they understood immediately and wished they didn't, told Mara everything before Tessa said another word. The timestamp changed, Tessa said. 22 minutes ago. The original note I logged, the version that was already altered, it's been accessed again. Is there a new modification? I can't tell from this view, but someone was in the file. Mara was already moving down the corridor toward the briefing room. Get out of the chart, she said. Right now. Save nothing that would show you accessed it. Do you understand? Yes. Go back to your floor. Act normal. I'll handle this from here. She ended the call and pushed through the briefing room door where Merritt was on his laptop, reading something that had the dense layout of a legal document. Someone just accessed the altered records at Harlow County, she said, while the injunction is active, 20 minutes ago. Merritt looked up. Storch, Mara said. She knows. He reached for his phone without another word. She stood across the table and watched him dial and listened to 3 seconds of ringing before someone picked up, and Merritt said, with the particular tone of someone escalating something up a chain that did not move slowly, I need to speak with Director Callahan. Tell her it's Merritt. Tell her it's the Harlow County matter. Tell her it cannot wait. 3 seconds of hold. Then a voice on the other end. And then Merritt said, the subject is in the records right now. I need the freeze enforced immediately, injunction pending or not. You need to get someone physically in that building today. Mara stood in the doorway of the small room in a military facility that wasn't on any map, 40 miles from the hospital, that had boxed up her things and watched her leave, and felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of something she had spent 14 months trying to hold together by herself, finally becoming something larger than herself. And then her own phone rang. Unknown number, different from before. She answered. Ms. Voss. The voice was female, crisp, the tone of someone who made consequential decisions for a living. My name is Director Elise Callahan, Oregon State Medical Quality Board. I've been reviewing your submitted documentation for the past 2 hours. I have some questions, but first I need to tell you something. Okay, Mara said. The anonymous submission we received this morning, the audit log comparison. We've been able to verify a portion of its contents against our own forensic access to Harlow County's system. The modification pattern is real. The falsification is real. A pause. And in the pause, Mara could hear the say something with real consequence. And in the last 24 minutes, someone at that institution has attempted to access and alter 7 additional patient records that were not in the original submission. 7. Not 1. Not a single careful move. 7. Which meant panic. Which meant Storch had understood that the window was closing and had made the specific kind of desperate, large-scale decision that people made when they stopped being careful and started being afraid. "We are sending investigators to the facility today," Callahan said. "Physical presence. This afternoon. I wanted you to know." "What about the injunction?" Mara asked. "Emergency motion to vacate. We filed it 20 minutes ago. Given what we've seen in the last half hour, the judge will grant it." Another pause. "Ms. Voss, you should also know, the documentation you submitted, combined with what we've now recovered from the system, is sufficient to move this to a formal evidentiary proceeding against multiple individuals." Mara stood in the corridor and looked at the wall in front of her, painted the utilitarian beige of every government facility she had ever been in, unremarkable and consistent. "Multiple," she said. "Storch, Blackwell, and Galloway all have documented involvement at different levels. Storch as the primary agent of record falsification, Blackwell and Galloway as the physicians whose conduct the falsification was designed to protect." Callahan's voice remained even, but there was something underneath it. Not satisfaction exactly, but the particular tone of someone who had been in this work long enough to know how rare it was for a case to be this clear. "We also have the Bast family's attorney on the line with our legal team as of this morning." Mara thought about Warren Bast. 31 years of service. His daughter making calls no one returned. "She kept pushing," Mara said, mostly to herself. "I'm sorry?" "His daughter. She didn't stop." A brief pause. "No, she didn't." Callahan's voice shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but acknowledging something human in the space between them. "Ms. Voss, I'd like to schedule a formal interview with you as soon as possible, in person. Would you be available to travel to Salem this week?" "I can make that work," Mara said. "Good. My office will contact you with details." Another pause, shorter this time. "I want to say one more thing, off the record." "Okay." "What you documented over 14 months in the conditions you were working under, that's not nothing. People don't usually do that. They mean to, they think about it. But the daily friction of documenting everything, maintaining it, keeping it organized against the day it might matter, most people can't sustain that." Mara didn't say anything. "I've been doing this job for 16 years, Callahan said. "The cases that go somewhere are almost always the ones where someone, somewhere, kept records when it would have been easier not to." A brief pause. "Thank you, Ms. Voss." The call ended. Mara stood in the corridor for a moment. The facility hummed around her with the ambient sounds of contained activity. Machinery, ventilation, voices from somewhere down the hall. Outside, through a narrow window at the end of the corridor, the Oregon ridgeline sat against a sky that had finally decided to be clear. She should have felt something clean at that moment, a sense of resolution beginning, of machinery locking into place. And she did feel that partly. But she also felt the particular exhaustion of someone who had been right about something for a very long time and was only now being given permission to set it down. She went back to check on Rafferty. He looked at her face when she walked in and read it the way people who had spent years in high-stakes environments learned to read faces, quickly, accurately, without asking. "It's moving," he said. "It's moving." He nodded once. Then, "And Storch?" Mara sat down in the chair beside his bed for the first time in 2 days. She hadn't realized until she was in it how much she needed to sit down. "She panicked," Mara said. "Tried to alter 7 more records in the last half hour." Rafferty was quiet for a moment. "That's a gift." "It's evidence," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the same careful directness that she had come to associate with him. "You knew she would." "I thought she might." People who've been careful for a long time have a specific way of falling apart when they realize the careful hasn't worked. She looked at her hands. "They go big instead of going quiet. They make it worse." "You counted on that." She thought about how to answer that. It wasn't quite right, but it wasn't quite wrong either. She had known that the moment Storch understood the investigation was real, she would have a choice, and that the choice Storch made would tell the board more than anything Mara could submit herself. I gave her the opportunity, Mara said finally. She made the choice. Rafferty lay back against the bed and was quiet for a moment. The monitoring equipment made its steady sounds. His oxygen read 98. You know what your problem is, Voss? He said. Several things, I'm sure. Your timing, he said. You're always right at the exact worst moment for everyone who's wrong. He looked at the ceiling. I mean that as a compliment, but I understand why they fired you. She looked at him. I'd have fired you too, he said. And I'd have been wrong. She was about to answer when Prest appeared in the doorway with her tablet and an expression that was not her normal expression. Voss, she said, Merritt needs you, right now. Rafferty's, he's fine. This is something else. Prest's expression was controlled, but not fully controlled, which was enough to bring Mara to her feet. There's a call coming in from the board in 11 minutes, but that's not the thing. The thing is, she glanced at her tablet. Harlow County General Hospital's CEO just called Merritt directly, 20 minutes ago, before the investigators even arrived. Mara looked at her. He wants to make a deal, Prest said. He's offering full cooperation in exchange for reduced penalties for the institution. He's throwing Storch, Blackwell, and Galloway over completely. She paused. And he says there are 2 more names, people involved in the falsification that weren't in any of the submitted documentation, people nobody's looked at yet. Mara stood at the foot of Rafferty's bed and felt the shape of the thing shift again, the way it kept shifting, the way it always did when you thought you'd seen the full dimension of a problem and then a wall came down to reveal the room behind. It was larger than you'd understood. Who? She said. Prest looked at the tablet. He won't say over the phone, she said. He'll only give the names in person, to the board investigators, and he's made one condition. She looked up at Mara. He'll only talk if you're in the room. Merritt was already on the phone when Mara reached the briefing room, standing at the window with his back to the door and his free hand pressed flat against the frame in the way people stood when they were receiving information they needed to hold still for. He didn't turn around when she came in. He held up one finger, which she read as, "Give me 60 seconds," and she sat down and waited. The call ended. He turned around. CEO's name is Gerald Patton, he said. He's been at Harlow County 11 years. Came up through hospital administration in California before that. According to the board, he's had no prior disciplinary history, no complaints, nothing flagged. He pulled the chair out across from her and sat in it with the controlled movement of someone managing a lot of information. He called my direct line, which tells me someone gave it to him, which means he's been doing his own research on who's been pushing this investigation. He found you through the Bast connection, Mara said. Most likely. The Bast family's attorney has been talking to a lot of people. He put his phone on the table. Patton says he learned about the falsification 6 weeks ago. He says he confronted Storch, who told him it was isolated, minor, already corrected. He believed her. A pause. He says he stopped believing her this morning when the board's freeze request came through and Storch's response was to call legal before she called him. Mara thought about that. The sequence mattered. A CEO who calls legal before informing the person responsible for institutional governance is a CEO who has already decided their problem is the institution, not the truth. Storch had made that calculation in real time, and Patton had read it. What does he actually know about the 2 additional names? She asked. He says he found documentation in Storch's office files, physical files, not electronic, printed correspondence between Storch and 2 members of the hospital board of directors. Merritt's voice stayed even, but there was something under it, the specific register of someone who has received information that changes the scale of a problem. Board members who were copied on certain decisions, who received summaries of disciplinary actions against staff, including yours. The room was quiet. They knew, Mara said. According to what Patton found, at least 2 of them were informed when Storch began building the disciplinary case against you. The correspondence references the need to manage staffing risk and protect physician relationships. He looked at her directly. They used those words, in writing. She absorbed it. 14 months of being managed like a risk, of having her judgment questioned and her record revised and her instincts treated as institutional liabilities. And somewhere above the level she'd been watching, two people on a board of directors had received summaries of that process and said nothing and let it continue. "He'll only give you the names in the room," she said. "With you present." "Yes." Merritt looked at her steadily. "The board has agreed to accommodate that condition. Callahan is sending 2 investigators to Harlow County this afternoon. They want you there. Patton specifically. But Callahan also independently requested your presence, because your documentation is the corroborating spine of their entire case, and she wants you available for real-time verification if something in Patton's account doesn't match." "When?" 4 hours. He checked his watch. "Which means we need to move." She looked at him. "Rafferty." "Levin can manage Rafferty for 8 hours. He's stable. You know that." He said it without apology because it was simply true, and she appreciated that he didn't soften it into something that required her to disagree. "You're needed somewhere else right now." She thought about Rafferty in that bed, improving incrementally, eating food he treated like a task. She thought about what he'd said. "I'd have fired you too, and I'd have been wrong." "Okay," she said. They drove rather than flew, which was a choice that made sense. Arriving at a civilian hospital in a military helicopter a second time would have been its own kind of statement, and the statement the situation required right now was not spectacle, but process. The investigators from the board would be arriving in their own vehicles. It needed to look like what it was, an official inquiry, conducted through proper channels, documented at every step. Merritt drove. Prest was in the back. Mara was in the passenger seat watching the Oregon landscape move past and thinking about Gerald Patton, who had run a hospital for 11 years and had either not known what was happening beneath him or had known and decided not to look directly at it, and how little difference that distinction made to the people whose records had been altered. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "That he only found out 6 weeks ago?" Merritt was quiet for a moment. "I believe he thinks that's true," he said, which was a more careful answer than yes. She understood the distinction. People who ran institutions did a particular kind of selective noticing. They registered information that confirmed the story they'd already constructed about their organization and filtered the rest through a layer of institutional confidence that made everything look manageable from the right distance. Patton may genuinely have not known the specifics, but he had certainly been in proximity to the conditions that allowed them. "The board will determine his culpability," Merritt added. "I know." She looked out the window. "I just want to understand who I'm walking into a room with." Press spoke from the back. "According to Callahan's assistant, Patton asked for you specifically because," and I'm quoting what the assistant told our office, "she's the only person whose account of events he trusts completely." Mara looked at the road ahead. "He's read my documentation," she said. "All of it," Press confirmed. "Callahan's team shared it with him this morning as part of the cooperation agreement framework. He went through it in about 2 hours." She thought about what that meant. A man reading 14 months of her meticulous, unglamorous record-keeping and arriving at the conclusion that she was the trustworthy one. It meant he'd seen the gap between what her record said and what the official documentation said, and he'd understood which version had the texture of truth. It was not a comfortable feeling. Not because it was bad, but because being trusted by someone who should have acted sooner carried a specific ambivalence that she didn't have a clean word for. They arrived at Harlow County General at 2:47 in the afternoon. The parking structure where Mara had sat 6 days ago with her cardboard box was exactly the same. The same fluorescent strip lights, the same oil-stained concrete, the same smell of exhaust and closed-in air. Her car was gone, which meant someone had either towed it or she'd left her keys accessible and a security guard had moved it. She'd deal with that later. The board investigators were already in the building, 2 of them, a man named Harbor and a woman named Solis, both in the particular neutral professional dress that investigators seemed to select specifically to look like no one you'd remember. Callahan wasn't there in person, which Mara had expected. The director would remain at a distance, maintaining the formal separation between institutional authority and fieldwork, at least until the fieldwork produced something definitive. Patton had arranged the meeting in the hospital's main conference room on the administrative floor, which Mara had been in once before, for a performance review in her 7th month that had been the institutional equivalent of a warning shot she'd understood too late. The room had a long table, a whiteboard, and a view of the parking structure. She noted the irony without finding it particularly interesting. Patton was already there when they arrived. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with the kind of face that had spent years performing calm regardless of what was underneath. And right now the performance was fraying in specific ways. The set of his shoulders, the way he'd arranged and then rearranged the papers on the table in front of him. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and was about to put it down in a room full of strangers, which was more or less exactly what he was. He looked at Mara when she walked in. His expression did something complicated. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Mr. Patton." He looked at her for a moment the way people looked at you when they'd spent hours reading your words and were now calibrating them against your physical presence. Then he looked at the investigators and at Merritt, and he sat down. "I want to state for the record," he said, "that my cooperation in this matter is voluntary and unconditional. I'm not making it contingent on reduced penalties for the institution. I told the attorneys that was the condition because I needed to ensure the right people would be in the room." He paused. "I needed her in the room." He looked at Mara again. "Because I owe her that. And because she's the only person whose version of events I can use as a reference point when I'm telling you what I know." Investigator Solis, who had been setting up a recording device with the efficiency of someone who had done it several hundred times, looked up. "Mr. Patton, for the record, do you waive your right to have counsel present during this interview?" "My attorney is aware of this meeting and has advised me to proceed," he said. "Yes." Solis nodded and started the recording. What followed was not a dramatic confession in the sense that anything dramatic happened in the room. It was methodical, procedural, and at moments deeply tedious in the way that accountability almost always was in practice. Nothing like the clean confrontations people imagined, full instead of paper trails and organizational charts, and the careful establishing of who knew what and when. Patton laid it out in the ordered way of someone who had rehearsed it enough that the sequence was fixed. Storch had begun the record falsification program approximately 13 months ago, initially in response to a single malpractice inquiry involving Blackwell. A patient family had raised questions about post-operative monitoring failures. Storch had altered 3 nursing notes in that patient's file to show earlier physician notification than had actually occurred. The malpractice inquiry had been dropped. The alteration had worked. After that, the pattern had expanded. Not because Storch was protecting Blackwell specifically, though she was, but because she had constructed her entire administrative identity around the hospital's physician relationships. And those relationships were worth protecting at any cost she could make invisible. Galloway's involvement had come later, when he'd caught a discrepancy between his own recollection of an incident and the nursing notes as they appeared in the system. He'd gone to Storch. She'd shown him what she'd done. Rather than report it, he'd accepted the version that protected him, which made him complicit without making him the architect. Blackwell had known from early, had benefited most. Mara listened to all of this with the particular quality of attention she'd learned in environments where information arrived fast and needed to be stored accurately. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly. She noted the moments where Patton's account aligned exactly with her documentation and the moments where it added dimension she hadn't had. Then Investigator Harbour said, "You mentioned board members, Mr. Patton. We'd like to address that now." Patton reached into the folder in front of him and produced 2 printed pages. He slid them across the table. Harbour took them. Solis leaned to look. The names were at the top of the correspondence, in the to field. Marcus Elroy, chairman of the board. Diane Yoon, vice chair, finance committee. "The correspondence began 9 months ago," Patton said. Storch was providing them with monthly summaries of staffing risk management. That was the language she used. The summaries included updates on the disciplinary cases she was building against specific nurses. He paused. Ms. Voss's case was specifically referenced in 4 separate updates. The room was very quiet. "Elroy and Yoon received those summaries," Harbour said. "And responded?" Elroy responded twice, both times affirming that Storch was handling things appropriately. Patton's voice was neutral in a way that was clearly costing him effort. He used the phrase "protect the physician roster" in the second response. Harbour and Solis exchanged a look that communicated something precise and required no elaboration. Mara looked at the printed pages across the table. Somewhere in the correspondence her name appeared, and an update summarizing her as a staffing risk. 4 times. Monthly updates to a board chairman who had responded that things were being handled appropriately. She thought about what appropriately had meant in practice. The downgraded review, the written warnings, the termination letter, the cardboard box. She had the steady, grounded sensation of someone watching a structure reveal itself fully, not satisfied, but comprehending. The whole shape of it, finally visible. The investigators spent another 90 minutes going through documents with Patton. Mara answered questions twice, once to confirm the timeline of her first written warning against her own records, once to verify the date of the Rosalind Fitch incident. Both times her documentation matched Patton's account exactly, which was the point at which investigator Solis stopped being a person performing neutrality and became, briefly, a person who was clearly thinking something that professional decorum prevented her from saying aloud. After the formal session ended, Harbour made 2 calls in the corridor. He came back with the specific expression of someone who has set large things in motion and is now waiting for them to complete. Director Callahan has authorized us to notify the individuals, he said. Today. Board members first, then Storch, Blackwell, and Galloway. What does notification mean in practice? Merritt asked. Mandatory administrative leave for Storch, pending formal charges. The board members will be notified that the investigation encompasses their conduct. Blackwell and Galloway will receive formal notices of investigation and suspension of privileges, pending the medical board's review. Harbour looked at his notes. The Bast family's attorney has already been contacted. They're aware of the scope. The meeting began its formal conclusion. Recording stopped, papers organized, hands shaken. Patton stayed at the table after the investigators had moved toward the door, and Mara, who had started to stand, found herself staying too. They were briefly alone in the conference room. He looked at her with the specific discomfort of someone who knows an apology is both necessary and insufficient. I should have paid closer attention, he said. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a defense. It was just a man saying a true thing, which was more than she'd expected. Yes, she said. You should have. He nodded once, accepting that without trying to qualify it. Then, for what it's worth, the records I read, your documentation, I've run hospitals for 23 years. I've never seen a nurse keep records like that. The precision, the discipline. I had good training, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him putting something together, some understanding of what she'd been before Harlow County, though he didn't have the details. What are you going to do now? He asked. It was a genuine question. She hadn't answered it for herself yet. She thought about the travel nurse position in Portland that she'd been drafting a message about when the helicopter arrived. She thought about Merritt's 48-hour consulting request that had stretched into 6 days. She thought about Rafferty improving 1 percentage point at a time and Tessa Birch doing something difficult with her door closed. I haven't decided, she said. The notifications happened that afternoon, and Mara wasn't present for any of them, which was the correct arrangement. The investigators managed each one separately, in sequence, in the manner of people who understood that how you told someone their career was over mattered almost as much as the fact of it. She heard about them later, in pieces, through Merritt and one brief conversation with Tessa, who had witnessed the hallway outside Storch's office from a careful distance. Storch had been in her office when Harbour and Solis arrived. The door had been closed. It had stayed closed for 40 minutes, which was a long time for a notification meeting that was, in its formal elements, fairly straightforward. When the door opened, Storch's face had been the face of someone who had just understood the full distance between the story they'd been telling themselves and the story that was now in a government file with their name on it. She had not made a scene. She had walked out of her office with her bag over her shoulder and not spoken to anyone in the corridor. Tessa had been at the nursing station 30 feet away. Their eyes had not met. Blackwell's notification happened in a physician lounge on the 2nd floor. According to what Merritt was told, Blackwell had argued for 11 minutes, demanding to know on what basis and who had made these claims, and insisting that nursing staff did not have the professional standing to make assessments that resulted in physician discipline. The investigator had apparently allowed him to finish, then placed the documentation on the table and waited. He had been significantly quieter after that. Galloway had requested his attorney be present and had said almost nothing. The 2 board members, Elroy and Yoon, were reached by phone through the board's legal division. Their responses were not conveyed to Mara, and she didn't ask. She understood that part of the process would take longer, would involve layers of governance and institutional structure that moved at a different speed than clinical accountability. She wasn't satisfied by that, but she understood it. What mattered right now was the set of things that had happened today, the formal record of them, the documentation that would not be altered. She was in the hospital corridor, not the ER, the administrative floor, when she saw Tessa Birch coming toward her. Tessa was still in her scrubs, mid-shift, and she looked like someone who had been holding themselves together with concentration for several hours and was not entirely sure how much was left. She stopped when she saw Mara. "Hey," she said. "Hey," Mara said. Tessa looked at her. "Is it done? The notifications?" "As of about an hour ago." Tessa exhaled. It was a specific exhale. Not relief exactly, more the sound of someone letting go of a breath they'd been holding long enough that they'd stopped noticing. "I sent those emails this morning," she said. "The time-stamped records. Like you said." She looked down the corridor. "I kept thinking someone would notice, that Storch would call me in." "She was too busy trying to cover the bigger problem," Mara said. "She didn't have time to watch the floor." "That's a lucky coincidence." "Or she underestimated you," Mara said. "Same way she underestimated me. It's a pattern with her." Tessa looked at her for a moment with something that was trying to be wry and not quite getting there because the day had been too long for wry. "What happens to us, the nurses who—" She stopped. "I was the anonymous submission. The board knows that, right?" "They'll protect your identity during the investigation period," Mara said. "After that, if it goes to formal proceedings, they'll likely need you to testify. That's a different conversation, one you'll have with their team." "Will I lose my job?" It was the question underneath everything else, and Tessa asked it with the flat practicality of someone who needed an honest answer more than a reassuring one. "I don't know," Mara said. "New administration will come in. The board's report will document that whistleblowing employees acted in good faith. That's legal protection in this state." She paused. "But I'm not going to tell you there's no risk, because there is. There always is." Tessa nodded slowly. "I know," she said. I needed you to say it straight." "I know." They stood in the corridor for a moment in the specific silence of two people who had both made expensive decisions and were both still standing. Then Tessa said, "The patient, Rosalind Fitch, she sent a card to the nursing station last week." She looked at Mara. "I don't think she knew who specifically to address it to. It just said thank you to whoever it was who made her stay." Mara looked at the floor for a moment. "Okay," she said. It was all she had for that, and Tessa seemed to understand that was the complete response. Rafferty was sitting up without assistance when Mara returned to the facility that evening, genuinely sitting up. Not the careful negotiated inches of the morning, but upright, arms free, with a tablet in his lap and a half-eaten meal on the tray beside him, that he had clearly been working through with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything. He looked at her when she came in, read her face the way he'd learned to do. "How did it go?" "It went," she said, which he accepted as a sufficient summary. "Storch?" "Administrative leave pending formal charges. Blackwell and Galloway suspended pending medical board review." She sat down. "2 board members under investigation." "The board members," he said. That was the extra layer. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You look tired." "I am tired." "Eat something." "I will." He looked at his tablet, then back at her. "Merritt told me the board director wants you in Salem this week. Formal interview. Thursday." "And after that?" She looked at her hands. The question had been sitting in the back of the day's noise since Patton had asked it in the conference room. "What are you going to do now?" And she still didn't have an answer that was fully formed. She had possibilities. She had options she hadn't expected to have 4 days ago. Merritt had said something that morning, before they'd left the facility, that she'd been turning over without examining directly. "There's a position," she said slowly. Merritt mentioned it. Military trauma consultation, working with the medical teams that support special operations units, training, protocols, field guidance. She paused. He said Hargrove's been trying to build a program for people with combined military and civilian clinical experience. Medics who've transitioned out but have current civilian practice backgrounds. Rafferty was very still. That would be using both things, he said. Yes. Not hiding either one. No. He looked at her with the considering expression that was the closest he got to warmth. You'd be good at it, he said. I don't know that yet. I do. He said it without emphasis, as a statement of observed fact. You kept me alive in a facility that was stretched with equipment you had to improvise around by catching something a board-certified surgeon missed, and you explained it to him in a way that let him fix it without making him feel like an idiot. He stopped. That's a specific skill set that isn't common. She looked at him. You're better at receiving care than you were 4 days ago. I'm trying, he said, with the particular flatness of someone making a genuine concession. She smiled at that briefly, which was the first time she'd done it in several days and felt slightly unfamiliar. She was about to say something else when her phone buzzed on the chair beside her. She looked at it, Callahan's number. She answered. Ms. Voss, Callahan said, and her voice had a quality that was different from the morning call. Not controlled urgent, but controlled complicated, a register Mara had learned to pay attention to. I apologize for the hour. There's something you need to know before tomorrow. Okay, Mara said. The formal records review that our forensic team completed this afternoon. The complete system audit of Harlow County's electronic files over the past 13 months. A pause. We found something in the audit that was not in the anonymous submission and was not in your documentation. Mara sat very still. There's a secondary file set, Callahan said, maintained outside the primary patient record system, accessed through a separate login, using credentials that don't belong to Storch or to anyone we've identified so far. She paused again. These files don't contain altered patient records. They contain personnel records, communication logs, private correspondence between hospital employees. Another pause. Including correspondence involving you, Ms. Voss, beginning not 11 months ago. Beginning in your second week at Harlow County General. Her second week. Not after she'd become a problem. Before. Someone was watching me from the beginning, Mara said. Someone was building a file on you from the beginning, Callahan said. We don't know who yet. The login credentials are encrypted through a proxy that our IT team is still working to unravel. The pause this time was longer. Ms. Voss, the content of those files suggests that your hiring at Harlow County was not coincidental. That someone with access to your military record brought you there deliberately. The room around Mara, Rafferty in his bed, the monitoring equipment, the utilitarian walls, all of it stayed exactly the same, while something in the center of her understanding of the past 14 months rearranged itself entirely. Someone recruited me, she said. That's one interpretation, Callahan said carefully. What's the other one? A pause. That someone brought you there to watch you fail, Callahan said, and then used what they built on you to ensure that you would. Mara sat with the phone against her ear for a moment after Callahan finished speaking, not because she needed more time to understand what had been said, but because understanding it and knowing what to do with it were two different operations, and she needed a breath between them. Rafferty was watching her. He had the stillness of someone who had learned that the most useful thing you could do in the moment after someone received significant information was to not add noise to it. She lowered the phone. Someone set you up, he said. Not a question. He'd heard enough of her side of the call. Someone brought me there knowing what would happen, she said, knowing the environment, knowing that if I did what I always do, the institution would eventually move against me. She looked at the wall across from her. They just didn't account for what I'd do while I was waiting for it. The documentation, she said. She thought about the encrypted proxy login. The secondary file set started in her second week, before the first incident report, before the first complaint from Blackwell, before she'd given anyone a formal reason to watch her closely. Someone had started a file on her before she'd done anything except show up and do her job. That required foreknowledge. Foreknowledge required a source with access to information she hadn't shared with the hospital. Her military record. Her real military record. Not the general service history that appeared in a standard background check, but the specifics. Fort Kavanaugh. The 13th. What she'd actually done and how well she'd done it. The list of people who had access to that was short. She called Merritt. He picked up on the second ring. I heard, he said, which meant Callahan had already reached him. I've been thinking about it for the last 20 minutes. The proxy login, she said. The encrypted credentials. Your IT team or the board's? Board's forensic unit is running it, but I've already put a parallel request through our side. A pause. Voss, I need to ask you something directly. Ask. Is there anyone from your service record, anyone with access to your file, who would have had a reason to want you in a position where your credibility could be systematically destroyed? She sat with that question. She had asked herself versions of it in the past 14 months without ever letting the asking become too specific, because specificity required conclusions she hadn't had enough evidence to reach. But she thought about it now the way she should have thought about it then, methodically, without flinching from the answer that the evidence pointed toward. There's one name, she said. Merritt waited. Major Calvin Reed, she said. Medical Oversight, 13th Battalion. He was my evaluating officer for the last 8 months of my second rotation. We disagreed about a field protocol that he had authored. I documented my disagreement formally. The protocol was subsequently revised by the command surgeon, which effectively meant Reed's work was rejected. Silence on the line. He would have had access to your complete file, Merritt said. He would have had access to everything, including my transition paperwork, including where I landed after discharge. And the timeline of the secondary file at Harlow County starts 14 days after my hire date, she said, which is enough time for someone who knew I'd been hired to arrange access to the system and set up a monitoring structure. Another silence. Longer. That's not a small operation, Merritt said carefully. That's someone with resources and connections and a very specific kind of patience. I know. Reed is still active duty. I know that too. She heard him exhale, not frustrated, more the sound of a man expanding the scope of a problem he was already carrying. I'm going to make some calls, he said. This is above the board's jurisdiction. If a serving officer used classified personnel access to engineer a civilian whistleblower suppression operation, that's a different category of problem entirely. What category? The kind that goes to Inspector General, he said. And above. She understood what above meant. She had spent enough time in institutional structures to know that the ceiling of one system was the floor of another, and that certain things, once they broke through, acquired a momentum of their own that individual people could not redirect. I want to know when you have something, she said. You'll know, he said, and ended the call. Poteg. She didn't sleep much that night, which she'd expected. She lay on the cot and ran the geometry of it. Reed, the secondary file, the 14 months, the careful architecture of a situation designed to produce a specific outcome. She thought about the quality of patience it required to set something like that in motion and wait for it to resolve. She thought about how close it had come to working, if Rafferty's team hadn't needed a medic with her specific background, if Merritt hadn't pulled her file, if the board hadn't had the Bast family pushing from the other direction, if Tessa Birch had looked away instead of looking at an audit log at 4 in the morning. A lot of ifs. A longer chain than she was comfortable with. She thought about what Callahan had said on the first call. Most people can't sustain that. The documentation, the daily accumulation of dates and incidents and outcomes maintained against the possibility of a day that might never come. She hadn't kept those records because she'd known about Reed. She'd kept them because it was what she'd been trained to do in environments where the written record was the only thing that survived when everything else went wrong. Her training had been used against her, and then her training had saved her. There was something in that she didn't have a clean word for. The call from Merritt came at 6:40 a.m. Reed, he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has confirmed something they hoped was wrong. His access logs show 7 logins to the personnel database in the 48 hours following your hire at Harlow County. He accessed your full classified service record twice. Then there's a gap of 2 weeks before the secondary file appears at the hospital. He paused. We also found a communication thread between a personal email account registered to Reed and an account that traces back to a consulting firm. The firm has connections to 3 board members across 2 Oregon hospital systems. She sat up on the cot. He had institutional connections, she said. He had an entire network, Merritt said. It looks like Harlow County wasn't the first. There are 2 other cases in the past 4 years. Nurses with military backgrounds who were terminated from civilian positions under similar circumstances. Both had documented conflicts with physicians. Both had clean military records. He stopped. Neither of them had kept documentation the way you did. Both cases were closed as routine HR decisions. Two others. She thought about two other women, or men, she didn't know, who had gone through versions of what she'd gone through and whose stories had ended in the cardboard box without the helicopter arriving, who had not had a Colonel Warren Bast in their patient population whose daughter made calls that reached the right people, who had not been in a position where a military asset needed saving, and her name was the one Dex Hargrove gave. She felt something cold and precise move through her. "What happens, Reed?" she asked. "IG opened a formal inquiry at 0600 this morning," Merritt said. "Given the classified personnel access, the cross-institutional pattern, and the connection to a civilian healthcare suppression operation, he's been placed on administrative hold pending the investigation." A pause. "Which in practical terms means he's done. Even if the IG process takes time, his career ended this morning." "And the two other nurses?" "The inquiry will include their cases. The board is looping in the relevant state offices. It won't undo what happened to them." He said it plainly, without trying to make it sound better than it was. "But it will be on record, and the physicians and institutions involved will be reviewed." It didn't undo anything for those two people. She understood that. Record reviews and institutional accountability were not time machines, but they were the difference between a system that corrected itself, eventually, imperfectly, and one that just kept running. "Thank you," she said, because it was the accurate thing. "Thank Hargrove," Merritt said. "He's the one who knew which name to give me." The formal interview with the Oregon State Medical Quality Board took place on Thursday in Salem, in a conference room that was larger and more deliberately serious than the one at Harlow County. Callahan was there in person, a woman in her early 50s with direct eyes and the particular economy of movement of someone who had long since stopped performing authority and simply embodied it. There were two attorneys, a forensic analyst, and a court recorder. Mara answered questions for 4 hours and 11 minutes. She did not rush any of them, did not soften anything, did not frame her account in the way that made her look better or Storch look worse than the evidence already made them. She answered what was asked with the precision of someone who had maintained 14 months of documentation for exactly this purpose and therefore did not need to reconstruct anything from memory. It was already written down. It had always been written down. At the end, Callahan walked her to the elevator and said, in the corridor while the recorder was out of earshot, "We'll have a preliminary finding in 2 weeks. I'll tell you now that the direction of that finding is not in question." "What about Elroy and Yoon?" Mara asked. "The board members." "Both have retained separate counsel." Callahan's voice was even. "Both are cooperating with the investigation, which is what people do when they understand that the alternative is worse." She pressed the elevator button. "Elroy sent a statement this morning through his attorney calling the correspondence with Storch a misunderstanding of administrative communications. His attorney is very good." A brief pause. "The documentation is better." The elevator arrived. "Ms. Voss," Callahan said, "what you're going to see in the coming weeks. The formal findings, the disciplinary actions, the public statements. Some of it will be satisfying. Some of it will feel inadequate. That's how these processes work. They are better than nothing and worse than justice, most of the time." She looked at her steadily. "The thing I want you to hold on to is that those two other nurses, the ones in the IG inquiry, their cases exist now. They have a record. Someone is looking at them." She paused. "That happened because you kept records when it would have been easier not to." The elevator doors stayed open. "I know," Mara said. "I don't think you fully do," Callahan said, not unkindly. "But you will." The preliminary findings were released in 17 days, which was faster than Callahan had suggested and faster than Mara had expected. She read them on her laptop in the apartment she'd moved back into, surrounded by the particular quiet of a space that had been empty for several days and still felt slightly provisional. The findings were 63 pages long, and she read all of them. Pamela Storch. Formal charges filed with the State Licensing Board for professional misconduct, falsification of medical records, and dereliction of administrative duty. Termination from Harlow County General Hospital, effective the date of administrative leave. The report used specific language, systematic and deliberate, which was the kind of language that ended careers and did not get walked back. Dr. Curtis Blackwell. Suspension of hospital privileges, formal investigation by the State Medical Board for patient safety violations, and complicity in record falsification. His license was under review. The report noted 3 specific patient incidents in which his clinical decisions, when examined against Mara's original nursing notes and the subsequently recovered unaltered records, showed a pattern of errors that had been obscured rather than addressed. Dr. Pete Galloway. Formal investigation, privileges suspended. His level of involvement was characterized as secondary. He had known, had accepted the cover, had not acted. The report was careful about degrees of culpability, which Mara understood even if she found the carefulness frustrating. Marcus Elroy. Formal censure, resignation from the board of directors requested and received. The findings noted that his correspondence with Storch constituted knowing endorsement of a discriminatory and retaliatory personnel practice targeting a clinical employee for patient advocacy activity. That sentence, when she read it, had the quality of something that should have been said much earlier and was only now being said at the right volume. Diane Yoon, formal censure, voluntary resignation from her committee position. Her attorney had apparently worked out an arrangement. Mara didn't know the specifics and didn't need to. Major Calvin Reed. The IG findings were not part of the public report, but Merritt had told her the morning before that the investigation had concluded with a recommendation for separation from service and referral to the Department of Justice for unauthorized use of classified personnel records in a scheme to cause professional harm to a civilian employee. Whether the DOJ moved on, it would depend on factors she couldn't control, but the recommendation was on record, and Reed's career was definitively over. She closed the laptop. She sat in the apartment for a while. She thought about what Callahan had said. Better than nothing and worse than justice. That was accurate. Storch faced charges, but the patients whose records she'd altered couldn't have those months back. Blackwell was under investigation, but Rosalind Fitch had spent 4 days in a cardiac unit after coming within hours of dying in her kitchen, and nothing in a report changed the fact of those 4 days. Reed would never wear a uniform again, but there were 2 nurses somewhere in Oregon whose careers had been quietly dismantled and who were not receiving any of the attention currently being directed at Mara's case. Better than nothing, worse than justice. The honest version of what accountability looked like in practice. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. Dex Hargrove. She answered. "Heard it came out," he said. His Tennessee flatness hadn't changed. "It came out," she confirmed. "Good." A pause. He wasn't a man who filled silence for the sake of it, which she'd always appreciated. "Merritt tells me you're thinking about the consultation position," he said. "I'm thinking about it." "What's holding you up?" She considered how to answer that honestly. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to be training people in institutional environments, given my record of getting along with institutions." She heard something on the other end that might have been a laugh, though with Hargrove it was difficult to be certain. "Voss, the people you'd be training work in environments where there are no institutions, just the team, the patient, and whatever's available." A pause. "They don't need someone who's good at the politics. They need someone who's good at keeping people alive when the plan has failed. That's a narrower skill set. It's the only skill set that matters in the field." His voice was even, the same way it had always been even, which was one of the things that made him easy to trust. Paktika Province, 2019. You improvised for 8 hours with equipment that wasn't designed for what you were using it for. 2 people alive because of that. A pause. "That's what I'm trying to bottle. I can't bottle it if you're working travel nursing in Portland." She didn't say anything for a moment. "It would mean relocating," she said. "Yes." "And working with military units again?" "As a civilian consultant. Different relationship than before. I'd have more control over my own protocols." "Significantly more," he said. "That was actually a condition I built into the program structure." Lesson learned. She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll give you 5 days," he said. "Then I'm calling Merritt and telling him you said yes." She went to Harlow County General one more time, not because she had to, but because there was something she needed to finish. She walked in through the ER entrance at a time she knew the floor would be between the morning rush and the afternoon load, when there would be a specific quality of relative quiet that the department had between crises. Tessa Birch was at the nursing station. She looked up when Mara came in. and her expression was the specific expression of someone who had been carrying something they'd expected to carry longer and hadn't been given permission to put down. "Hey," Tessa said. "Hey." Mara came to the station. "I wanted to give you something." She put a copy of the preliminary findings on the counter, opened to the page where the report addressed the role of internal whistleblowing in enabling the board's investigation. Tessa's name wasn't in it, protected, as promised, but the language was clear. An anonymous submission from within the institution provided critical forensic documentation that corroborated and in several instances exceeded the scope of external evidence. And then, 3 paragraphs later, the board recommends formal recognition of the institutional value of this action and that Harlow County General Hospital's incoming administration take affirmative steps to ensure the employee who provided this submission faces no adverse employment consequences. Tessa read it. She read it twice. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Is that—" she started. "Yes," Mara said. Tessa looked at the page. Then she put her hand flat on top of it, not covering it exactly, just touching it, the way you touch something you wanted to be sure was real. "The new administrator starts Monday," she said. "Patton resigned as part of the cooperation agreement. The board is bringing in someone from the outside." "I know. It's going to be strange here for a while." "Probably," Mara said. "But strange is survivable. The alternative is worse." Tessa looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone still working out how to exist in a situation where the thing they'd feared and done anyway had turned out not to destroy them. It was a specific kind of disorientation, the kind that came not from bad outcomes but from good ones you hadn't entirely believed were possible. "What are you going to do?" Tessa asked. "Something new," Mara said. She meant it. For the first time in a long time, she meant it without qualification. Owen Rafferty was discharged from the facility on a Tuesday, which was unremarkable except that it was the same day of the week Mara had been fired, and she noticed that without assigning it any particular meaning because she'd gotten too old and too tired for that kind of symmetry. She was there when he left. Not because anyone had asked her to be, but because she'd checked on him every day since returning from Salem, and the habit had become something else. Not friendship exactly, or not only that, but the particular connection that formed between people who had been in extremity together and come out knowing something specific about each other that ordinary circumstances didn't reveal. He was walking on his own, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was functional but not yet fully trusting of itself. He'd lost weight he hadn't had to lose. He looked in the specific way of people leaving medical facilities, both recovered and depleted. He stopped when he saw her in the corridor. "You didn't have to be here," he said. "I wanted to see you leave upright," she said. Something shifted in his face. "How's that for the minimum standard?" "In this context," she said, "upright is excellent." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Merritt told me about Reed." "Yes." "And the IG?" "Yes." He looked at her with the considering directness she had come to understand was his default mode when something mattered. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." "Okay." "When you were at Harlow County for 14 months, keeping all those records, documenting everything, did you know something was wrong? About how you got there? About why?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew the environment was wrong. I knew what was happening to me was organized in a way that felt like more than one person's decision." She paused. "I didn't know about Reed. I didn't know about the secondary file, but I knew it wasn't random." She looked at him. "Which is why I kept the records. Not because I knew it would matter, but because I couldn't prove it mattered if I didn't." He absorbed that. "My mother would have understood that," he said. She remembered him saying that, the county hospital, 32 years, coming home and not talking for hours. A woman who had known what the silence cost and paid it anyway because the alternative was leaving the knowing unwitnessed. "She sounds like someone worth understanding," Mara said. He nodded once. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was solid, careful, the grip of someone managing not to wince. "Don't be careful," she said. "I'm always careful," he said, "of the grip. Don't be careful of the grip." She looked at him. "You're fine. Stop protecting it." He looked at her for half a second, then shook her hand the normal way, and the normal way was fine. Well, she took the position. She called Hargrove on day 4, one day before his deadline, which she suspected he had calibrated specifically to leave her the dignity of deciding before he technically forced the issue. She told him yes in 2 sentences. He said good and asked when she could start, and she said 3 weeks, and he said 2, and she said 2.5, and he said fine. The relocation was not complicated. She'd been living in the Millbrook apartment on a month-to-month lease since her first week at Harlow County, which in retrospect she understood as a decision made by some part of her that had known before she consciously knew that nothing about that situation was going to be permanent. She packed in a day and a half. She found her car in long-term parking. It had been moved there by a security guard who'd left a note under the wiper saying didn't want it towed. Hope that's okay. And she stood next to it for a moment with the keys in her hand, thinking about sitting in the parking structure with a cardboard box and a phone that hadn't rung yet. The distance between that moment and this one was not large in chronological terms. In every other measure, it was the kind of distance that didn't have a unit. She thought about it sometimes, afterward, about what it cost to hold something together for a long time, without knowing if it would ever matter. About the specific weight of being accurate and ignored simultaneously. About the 2 nurses in other towns whose names she didn't know, whose files had been opened by the IG inquiry, whose outcomes she would never fully learn. About Tessa Birch at the nursing station, hand flat on a page, making sure it was real. About Rosalind Fitch's thank you card addressed to whoever it was. About what it meant that none of it had happened cleanly. That the helicopter had arrived because a soldier needed a medic, not because the truth had been noticed. That the investigation had opened because a family had the connections to make calls that got returned, not because the board had been watching. That the whole structure of what eventually became accountability had been assembled from pieces that were never designed to fit together and mostly shouldn't have. She thought about that, because the version of this story that ends with injustice was done wasn't her version. Her version ended with, and a lot of things happened, some of them in the right direction, because a lot of people made small, difficult, expensive decisions that they weren't sure would matter, and enough of those decisions accumulated that eventually the structure could hold what was put into it. That was the honest version. She preferred the honest version. She'd always preferred the honest version, which was the thing that had made her difficult, and which was also the thing that had made her indispensable, and which was not a contradiction, regardless of how many institutions had tried to convince her otherwise. The first training session she ran was in a facility she wasn't allowed to name, with 12 people who looked at her with the specific assessing flatness she'd spent her adult life recognizing. She looked back. "I'm going to assume you all know how to follow a protocol," she said, "which means we're going to spend most of our time on what you do when the protocol has failed, when the equipment isn't what it should be, when the diagnosis you were given doesn't match the patient in front of you." She paused. "When someone with more authority than you tells you you're wrong, and you're not." No one said anything. "I know what it's like to be right and ignored," she said. "I know what it costs. I'm not here to tell you that cost is small or that being right always wins in the end, because sometimes it doesn't." She looked at the room. "What I can tell you is how to keep doing it anyway. How to be the kind of person who notices what others miss and has the evidence to prove it when the moment comes." She paused. "That moment doesn't always come when you expect it. Sometimes it comes from a direction you never anticipated. But if you haven't kept the record, if you haven't documented the knowing while you were doing the work, you won't have anything to show when it does." She looked at 12 people who kept other people alive for a living. "So let's start with the record," she said, "and then we'll get to the rest." The room was quiet in the specific way of people who were listening, actually listening, which was all she had ever asked of anyone. She began. "Major Calvin Reed, the IG findings were not part of the public report, but Merritt had told her the morning before that the investigation had concluded with a recommendation for separation from service and referral to the Department of Justice for unauthorized use of classified personnel records in a scheme to cause professional harm to a civilian employee. Whether the DOJ moved on, it would depend on factors she couldn't control, but the recommendation was on record and Reed's career was definitively over." She closed the laptop. She sat in the apartment for a while. She thought about what Callahan had said. Better than nothing and worse than justice. That was accurate. Storch faced charges, but the patients whose records she'd altered couldn't have those months back. Blackwell was under investigation, but Rosalind Fitch had spent 4 days in a cardiac unit after coming within hours of dying in her kitchen, and nothing in her report changed the fact of those 4 days. Reed would never wear a uniform again, But there were two nurses somewhere in Oregon whose careers had been quietly dismantled and who were not receiving any of the attention currently being directed at Mara's case. Better than nothing, worse than justice. The honest version of what accountability looked like in practice. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. Dex Hargrove. She answered. "Heard it came out," he said. His Tennessee flatness hadn't changed. "It came out," she confirmed. "Good." A pause. I wasn't a man who filled silence for the sake of it, which she'd always appreciated. "Merritt tells me you're thinking about the consultation position," he said. "I'm thinking about it." "What's holding you up?" She considered how to answer that honestly. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to be training people in institutional environments, given my record of getting along with institutions." She heard something on the other end that might have been a laugh, though with Hargrove it was difficult to be certain. "Voss, the people you'd be training work in environments where there are no institutions, just the team, the patient, and whatever's available." A pause. "They don't need someone who's good at the politics. They need someone who's good at keeping people alive when the plan has failed. That's a narrower skill set. It's the only skill set that matters in the field." His voice was even, the same way it had always been even, which was one of the things that made him easy to trust. Paktika Province, 2019. You improvised for 8 hours with equipment that wasn't designed for what you were using it for. 2 people alive because of that. A pause. "That's what I'm trying to bottle. I can't bottle it if you're working travel nursing in Portland." She didn't say anything for a moment. "It would mean relocating," she said. "Yes?" "And working with military units again. As a civilian consultant, different relationship than before. I'd have more control over my own protocols." "Significantly more," he said. "That was actually a condition I built into the program structure. Lesson learned." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll give you 5 days," he said. "Then I'm calling Merritt and telling him you said yes." She went to Harlow County General one more time, not because she had to, but because there was something she needed to finish. She walked in through the ER entrance at a time she knew the floor would be between the morning rush and the afternoon load, when there would be a specific quality of relative quiet that the department had between crises. Tessa Birch was at the nursing station. She looked up when Mara came in, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who had been carrying something they'd expected to carry longer and hadn't been given permission to put down. "Hey," Tessa said. "Hey." Mara came to the station. "I wanted to give you something." She put a copy of the preliminary findings on the counter, open to the page where the report addressed the role of internal whistleblowing in enabling the board's investigation. Tessa's name wasn't in it, protected, as promised, but the language was clear. An anonymous submission from within the institution provided critical forensic documentation that corroborated and in several instances exceeded the scope of external evidence. And then, 3 paragraphs later, "The board recommends formal recognition of the institutional value of this action and that Harlow County General Hospital's incoming administration take affirmative steps to ensure the employee who provided this submission faces no adverse employment consequences." Tessa read it. She read it twice. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Is that—" she started. "Yes," Mara said. Tessa looked at the page. Then she put her hand flat on top of it, not covering it exactly, just touching it, the way you touch something you wanted to be sure was real. "The new administrator starts Monday," she said. "Patton resigned as part of the cooperation agreement. The board is bringing in someone from the outside." "I know. It's going to be strange here for a while." "Probably," Mara said. "But strange is survivable. The alternative is worse." Tessa looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone still working out how to exist in a situation where the thing they'd feared and done anyway had turned out not to destroy them. It was a specific kind of disorientation, the kind that came not from bad outcomes but from good ones you hadn't entirely believed were possible. "What are you going to do?" Tessa asked. "Something new," Mara said. She meant it. For the first time in a long time, she meant it without qualification. Owen Rafferty was discharged from the facility on a Tuesday, which was unremarkable except that it was the same day of the week Mara had been fired. And she noticed that without assigning it any particular meaning because she'd gotten too old and too tired for that kind of symmetry. She was there when he left. Not because anyone had asked her to be, but because she'd checked on him every day since returning from Salem, and the habit had become something else. Not friendship exactly, or not only that, but the particular connection that formed between people who had been in extremity together and come out knowing something specific about each other that ordinary circumstances didn't reveal. He was walking on his own, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was functional but not yet fully trusting of itself. He'd lost weight he hadn't had to lose. He looked, in the specific way of people leaving medical facilities, both recovered and depleted. He stopped when he saw her in the corridor. "You didn't have to be here," he said. "I wanted to see you leave upright," she said. Something shifted in his face. "How's that for the minimum standard?" "In this context," she said, "upright is excellent." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Merritt told me about Reed." "Yes." "And the IG." "Yes." He looked at her with the considering directness she had come to understand was his default mode when something mattered. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer." "Okay." "When you were at Harlow County for 14 months, keeping all those records, documenting everything, did you know something was wrong about how you got there? About why?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew the environment was wrong. I knew what was happening to me was organized in a way that felt like more than one person's decision." She paused. "I didn't know about Reed. I didn't know about the secondary file, but I knew it wasn't random." She looked at him. "Which is why I kept the records. Not because I knew it would matter, but because I couldn't prove it mattered if I didn't." He absorbed that. "My mother would have understood that," he said. She remembered him saying that. The county hospital, 32 years, coming home and not talking for hours. A woman who had known what the silence cost and paid it anyway because the alternative was leaving the knowing unwitnessed. "She sounds like someone worth understanding," Mara said. He nodded once. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was solid, careful, the grip of someone managing not to wince. "Don't be careful," she said. "I'm always careful," he said, of the grip. "Don't be careful of the grip." She looked at him. "You're fine. Stop protecting it." He looked at her for half a second, then shook her hand the normal way, and the normal way was fine. She took the position. She called Hargrove on day 4, one day before his deadline, which she suspected he had calibrated specifically to leave her the dignity of deciding before he technically forced the issue. She told him yes in 2 sentences. He said good and asked when she could start, and she said 3 weeks, and he said 2, and she said 2.5, and he said fine. The relocation was not complicated. She'd been living in the Millbrook apartment on a month-to-month lease since her first week at Harlow County, which in retrospect she understood as a decision made by some part of her that had known before she consciously knew that nothing about that situation was going to be permanent. She packed in a day and a half. She found her car in long-term parking. It had been moved there by a security guard who'd left a note under the wiper saying didn't want it towed. Hope that's okay. And she stood next to it for a moment with the keys in her hand, thinking about sitting in the parking structure with a cardboard box and a phone that hadn't rung yet. The distance between that moment and this one was not large in chronological terms. In every other measure, it was the kind of distance that didn't have a unit. She thought about it sometimes, afterward, about what it cost to hold something together for a long time, without knowing if it would ever matter. About the specific weight of being accurate and ignored simultaneously. About the 2 nurses in other towns whose names she didn't know, whose files had been opened by the IG inquiry, whose outcomes she would never fully learn. About Tessa Birch at the nursing station, hand flat on a page, making sure it was real. About Rosalind Fitch's thank you card addressed to whoever it was. About what it meant that none of it had happened cleanly. That the helicopter had arrived because a soldier needed a medic, not because the truth had been noticed. That the investigation had opened because a family had the connections to make calls that got returned, not because the board had been watching. That the whole structure of what eventually became accountability had been assembled from pieces that were never designed to fit together and mostly shouldn't have. She thought about that. Because the version of this story that ends with injustice was done wasn't her version. Her version ended with, and a lot of things happened, some of them in the right direction, because a lot of people made small, difficult, expensive decisions that they weren't sure would matter, and enough of those decisions accumulated that eventually the structure could hold what was put into it. That was the honest version. She preferred the honest version. She'd always preferred the honest version, which was the thing that had made her difficult, and which was also the thing that had made her indispensable, and which was not a contradiction, regardless of how many institutions had tried to convince her otherwise. The first training session she ran was in a facility she wasn't allowed to name, with 12 people who looked at her with the specific assessing flatness she'd spent her adult life recognizing. She looked back. "I'm going to assume you all know how to follow a protocol," she said, "which means we're going to spend most of our time on what you do when the protocol has failed, when the equipment isn't what it should be, when the diagnosis you were given doesn't match the patient in front of you." She paused. "When someone with more authority than you tells you you're wrong, and you're not." No one said anything. "I know what it's like to be right and ignored," she said. "I know what it costs. I'm not here to tell you that cost is small or that being right always wins in the end, because sometimes it doesn't." She looked at the room. "What I can tell you is how to keep doing it anyway, how to be the kind of person who notices what others miss and has the evidence to prove it when the moment comes." She paused. "That moment doesn't always come when you expect it. Sometimes it comes from a direction you never anticipated. But if you haven't kept the record, if you haven't documented the knowing while you were doing the work, you won't have anything to show when it does." She looked at 12 people who kept other people alive for a living. "So let's start with the record," she said, "and then we'll get to the rest." The room was quiet in the specific way of people who were listening, actually listening, which was all she had ever asked of anyone. She began.